Imagine you are walking through the foggy streets of Victorian London late at night. The gas lamps flicker, the cobblestones are slick with rain, and somewhere in the shadows, a respectable, well-loved gentleman is living a double life, so dark, so dangerous, that even his closest friends have no idea. Now ask yourself, have you ever felt like two different people? One version of you that the world sees, polished, controlled, appropriate, and another version buried underneath that wants something entirely different? Robert Louis Stevenson asked that very same question in 1886, and the story he wrote in answer to it became one of the most chilling, most psychologically loaded pieces of fiction in the English language. It gave us a phrase we still use today. It introduced an idea that psychology would later scramble to explain. And it told a horror story so elegant, so precise, that it still lands like a punch more than a century later. This is the story of Dr. Henry Jekyll and of Mr. Edward Hyde, and of the terrifying truth that they were never really two people at all. The story does not begin with Jekyll. It begins with a mystery and a door. We enter the world through the eyes of a London lawyer named Gabriel John Utterson. He's a steady, serious man, not exciting, but deeply loyal, the kind of person you trust without thinking about why. And one evening, his friend Richard Enfield tells him a strange story about a man he witnessed trampling a young girl in the street, without any remorse at all. He just walked right over her, and then paid off her family with a check signed by a name everyone in London would recognize, Dr. Henry Jekyll. The man who did the trampling was ugly in a way that Enfield could not quite explain. Not a particular feature out of place, not a scar or a deformity he could point to, just a deep instinctive wrongness. His name, it turned out, was Edward Hyde. Utterson is troubled. He knows Jekyll well. Jekyll is a brilliant, generous, well-respected doctor, a man of standing. So why has he written a will leaving everything to this repulsive stranger, Hyde? What is the connection between them? Utterson fears the worst, that Hyde is blackmailing his old friend, perhaps over some shameful secret from Jekyll's youth. He tries to meet Hyde, and when he finally does, he understands Enfield's reaction immediately. Hyde is short, pale, and carries around him an almost physical sense of menace. Something about him turns the stomach without being explainable. Utterson walks away disturbed in a way he cannot articulate. For a while, things seem to calm down. Jekyll appears in good health, holds dinners, is sociable and warm. Hyde seems to disappear. Utterson relaxes. And then everything unravels. A maid watching from her window witnesses Hyde beat a well-known elderly politician named Sir Danvers Carew to death in the street with a heavy cane. It is savage, unprovoked. The maid faints from shock. By the time anyone reaches the scene, Hyde is gone. Utterson brings the police to Hyde's apartment in Soho, a dark, chaotic place that feels somehow out of time, but Hyde has vanished. And Jekyll, when questioned, appears shaken to his core. He shows Utterson a letter he says was left by Hyde, promising to disappear forever. Utterson is suspicious. A handwriting expert tells him the letter appears to be written in Jekyll's own hand, with certain letters deliberately altered. Something is very wrong. But Jekyll insists he is free of Hyde now, and for months he seems like himself again, cheerful, engaged, doing charitable work. Utterson and his friends dare to hope. Then another friend of Jekyll's, a doctor named Hasty Lanyon, falls gravely ill. Lanyon has always been skeptical of Jekyll's more ambitious scientific theories, and the two drifted apart. But now Lanyon is dying, and the look on his face is not illness, it is horror. He has seen something he cannot unsee. Before he dies, he gives Utterson a sealed envelope with instructions not to open it until Jekyll is dead or disappeared. Jekyll himself begins to withdraw again. He locks himself in his laboratory. He will not see visitors. He communicates only through a closed door or through brief, anxious notes. His servants are frightened. Something is wrong inside that laboratory. There are sounds, and the voice, they whisper, no longer sounds quite like the master's. Finally, Utterson and Jekyll's butler, Poole, break down the laboratory door together. Inside, they find a body, a small, contorted, ugly body, already dying from poison. It is Hyde, and scattered around the room are letters, one addressed to Utterson. He takes everything home and reads. First, Lanyon's account. Lanyon describes how Jekyll sent him a frantic letter begging him to retrieve a specific drawer of chemicals and powders from the laboratory and to hand them over to a visitor who would come at midnight. Lanyon agrees, expecting something peculiar. At midnight, a small, wild-eyed man arrives, Hyde, collects the chemicals, mixes them into a potion, and then, against Lanyon's wishes, drinks it. And right there in front of him, Hyde transforms. The ugliness recedes, the features shift, and standing before Lanyon is Henry Jekyll. Lanyon cannot process it. The shock breaks him. He dies within weeks, not from physical illness, but from the sheer impossibility of what he has seen.
Then Utterson reads Jekyll's own confession. And here is where the story opens up into something genuinely extraordinary. Jekyll explains that he had long been fascinated by the idea that every human being contains within them two natures, a respectable, moral, social self, and a darker self of pure desire and impulse, free from conscience. He believed these two selves were not truly one person, but two separate beings trapped in one body. And he believed that if science could separate them, you could live freely as both, giving each nature its own time, its own freedom, without compromise. He developed a chemical compound that could achieve exactly that. When he drank it, he transformed. He became Hyde, smaller, younger, lighter in some strange physical sense, because Hyde was only one half of a full man, unburdened by any goodness or restraint. Hyde felt no remorse. He desired everything and denied himself nothing. And Jekyll, when he returned to his own form, told himself this was simply an experiment, that he remained in control. But Hyde grew stronger with use. The transformations began to happen without the potion. Jekyll would fall asleep as himself and wake as Hyde. He lost days. He lost control of when the change would occur. Hyde began to take over, and when Hyde killed Carew, Jekyll understood that it was already too late. He could no longer trust himself. He locked himself away, trying to hold Hyde back with chemicals, but his supply of a key ingredient ran out, and every batch he mixed from new stock failed to work. The original compound had relied on an impurity in the first batch, an impurity he could never identify or replicate. He was trapped. Hyde was winning, and so, in his final moments of clarity as Jekyll, he wrote his confession, knowing that Hyde would return and that this time there was no going back. The body Utterson found was Hyde, who had taken his own life rather than face the gallows, and Jekyll was simply gone, consumed, finally, by the self he had thought he could control. It would be easy to file this story away as a Victorian relic, gas lamps, stiff collars, melodrama, but the questions it raises have never felt more alive. We live in a time when people curate public versions of themselves obsessively, on social media, at work, in social settings. We present one face to the world and guard another carefully. The gap between who we appear to be and what we actually feel can be enormous, and the pressure to maintain that gap is real and exhausting. Stevenson saw this. He wrote a story about the psychological cost of repression, of forcing your darker impulses so far underground that they eventually detonate. Hyde is not an evil creature from outside.
He is Jekyll's own creation, his own shadow, given form and freedom. And the tragedy is not that Hyde exists. The tragedy is that Jekyll refused to acknowledge him as part of himself, and so lost all ability to govern him. Modern psychology talks about the shadow self, the parts of our personality we deny, suppress, and project onto others. Stevenson understood this intuitively a century before it had clinical language. The book is also a meditation on addiction, on the seduction of a behavior that feels freeing until it owns you completely, until the person you were before seems like a stranger. And it is a quiet indictment of Victorian moral rigidity, the idea that respectability was everything, that social performance mattered more than inner truth. What makes this story endure is not the science fiction of the potion, or even the horror of the transformation. It is the confession at the end. The moment Jekyll sits down and writes, with full clarity, what he did, why he did it, and how he lost. It is the most human moment in the book, a man looking at himself honestly, perhaps for the first time, when it is already too late. The real terror of Jekyll and Hyde is not Hyde's violence, it is Jekyll's self-deception, the belief that he could divide himself in two and take responsibility for only the half he liked, that he could indulge his darkness as long as he kept it properly labeled and properly separate, that he could be good by simply deciding that the bad parts weren't really him. Most of us never drink a potion, but most of us know what it is to tell ourselves that some part of what we are doesn't count, that some version of us that appears only in private, only under pressure, only in the dark, isn't really us at all. Stevenson's answer is quiet and unsparing. It is all you, every part of it. And the only way to be a whole person is to know that. That's not a Victorian idea. That's the work of a lifetime. And that is why, more than 100 years later, we are still talking about the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde.